Yeah, thanks very much, Comrade Luke. Let me start by thanking the Caribbean Labor Solidarity for holding this talk, as it is really important, because from time to time we have to do some reflection and analysis of the state of the labor movement, in this case in the Caribbean. And I'm happy to have had the opportunity to speak to the audience about the situation in the Caribbean. I also want to recognize that on the 4th of January, that would have been the 123rd birthday of the great Caribbean revolutionary Marxist thinker, C.L.R. James. So I dedicate this talk in his memory. Let me also use this opportunity and the Caribbean Labor Solidarity Forum to express directly to Comrade Alex Gordon our solidarity with the National Union of Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers, RMT, in their really epic struggle for the dignity of railway workers and other transport workers as well. And of course, the upcoming battle against Sunak's anti-strike laws. In this time of capitalist crisis, your struggle is indeed an inspiration. Let me also express solidarity to all the workers in the UK who are engaging in militant action. And it's really about dignity. The labor movement, of course, takes certain forms, whether as a parties or trade unions, credit unions, cooperative, and it is the nature of labor, its development, its changes, and its decisive forms in the various Caribbean countries that enable us to kind of think, clarify, and develop an analysis, or as CLR would say, a philosophic cognition about the object, meaning that object being Caribbean labor. So for us to really know the true reality of trade unions in the Caribbean, then we would have to understand labor as it moves through various historical stages, and therefore understand that at each stage, it could degenerate, it could split, it could reanimate itself, or even reinstate its self-identity as a revolutionary force shaping Caribbean society. And it is part of the process. And through this process, of its own development, you will see the different setbacks, divisions, etc. But at the end, it is really for labor to overcome these challenges one after the other. Now, I want to start with a key turning point for Caribbean trade unions, and it may seem, and I'll explain why I go back to that. In 1938, just 1 year after the 37 Labor Rebellion, you had this revolutionary program found in the summary of resolutions, which was passed by the British Guyana and West Indian Labour Congress. And they were calling for things like federation, self-government, universal adult suffrage. But what was interesting is that they had called for public ownership of all utilities, utility services. Now, last one is relevant and important in light of the current climate crisis, where the World Bank and IMF are now trying to push the neoliberal approach of privatize to decarbonize. And I believe that the trade unions in the Caribbean response have to be a push for an alternative, which is a public pathway approach, which of course is consistent with those sort of first principles as articulated in that 1938 program. Now, one of the things that, or context that trade unions have to navigate through is, of course, the fact that many of the Caribbean governments are pursuing a neoliberal development strategy, which is enshrined in this European Partnership Agreement. And I think one of the things that the Caribbean Congress of Labour had called for, I mean, their general response was reformist, but at least the call for the harmonization of labor laws across the region is crucial to protect workers, because under the new instruments of capitalism, which is this bilateral investment treaties, what you find built in those BITs, or bilateral investment treaties, are in fact greater protection of capital. So this is the context that the trade union movement has to navigate. So allow me to use just a few examples and we'll see from these particular examples that we can extrapolate a more general understanding of the sort of trade union landscape, right? So let me start with Jamaica. Now, in Jamaica, what you find is an excessive requirement with respect to trade unions representativity. So the state can impose fixed and unreasonable procedural requirements for collective bargaining. And you'll see how that playing itself out in reality in the recent negotiations with the public sector workers. And then there are limitations and even outright banning on collective bargaining in some sectors. So some sectors of workers in Jamaica can't even have exercise the right to collective bargaining. And then there are severe limitations on the fundamental right to strike. There are restrictions with respect to this, what the state called the objective of a strike. And then there are even restrictions with respect to what, as to the type of strike. Now, in terms of the balance of forces and power, the authorities and employers in Jamaica, I'm speaking of here specifically, they have the power to unilaterally prohibit, limit, suspend, and even in some cases cease strike action. And when workers do take strike action, then the state, which the state considered unauthorized, there's this excessive civil sanctions for the workers and the unions. Now, interestingly enough, the Jamaica public sector workers were forced to turn to strike action to protest against the government's plans to reform the public sector. You know, that's a big thing throughout the region. And last year, there were several walkouts staged by workers belonging to a number of different trade unions. You had workers from the National Water Commission. They had gone on strike for 2 days last year, May, leading to a nationwide water shortage. You had tourism was disrupted with the strike action by the air traffic controllers. Then you had employees from the National Housing Trust that had walked out. And these labor unrests were a response to the government push for a sort of large-scale restructuring of the civil service, as well as a 12-year wage freeze. And then you had about 30,000 civil servants were threatening strike action, but as always the case, the Jamaica Civil Service Association decided to withdraw their notice to strike following a meeting with the Minister of Finance, Nigel Clark. So again, we see coming on to the end of last year, some division with some unions under the Jamaica Confederation of Trade Unions accepting the government's offer in November. And this really came after Jamaica Civil Service Association broke ranks around the 10th of November and then calling on all the on the other unions to sign. And by the following week, 14 unions had signed the package. Let us now look at Barbados, who recently became a republic. Again, the state has the power to intervene even as early in the preparation of collective agreements. And then on top of that, there's this absence of appropriate mechanisms to really encourage and promote the machinery for collective bargaining. Like Jamaica, there are restrictions to what they call the objective of a strike, as well as restrictions with respect to the type of strike with excessive damages caused by strike action, right? There's a proliferation of precarious employment, which is hampering unionization and even the negotiation in the domestic work sector. But interestingly, labor in Barbados in 2015, there was a nationwide strike. Major public sector unions staged massive demonstration. And that action really came in wake of the growing frustration with the austerity policies put in place in 2014 by the then government, led by Freudel Stewart, which included salary cuts, mass layoffs, all with a so-called intention to cut the fiscal deficit. That's what he called it, right? But clearly the activities of the trade unions in Barbados and their response to the fiscal austerity of Stewart caused a major political shift with the elections of Mayor Motley. And she announced in September last year the beginning of public sector negotiations. Public sector workers in Barbados have not seen a wage increase really between 2008 and 2018, where they only got a one-off payment in 2018 of 5%. And that was really Stewart trying to appease the unrest that was building up. But it was more or less too late for him. But like a bit in Jamaica, you saw a division within the movement with separate celebrations of May Day. Last year, you had one federation, the Barbados Workers Union in one part, and then you had the Public Sector Workers Union in another part. So it'll be interesting to see how the movement will respond to these public sector negotiations, which was announced. For one thing, what we do know is the Barbados Union of Teachers responding to the central bank governor's statement that the government would have to do, according to him, make some very difficult choices in order to facilitate an increase in wages. The Barbados Union of Teachers already made it clear that they will be demanding double digits. So I think it's something to keep an eye on in terms of how the movement responds to, especially in light of Mia Mottley's popularity. In Guyana, you had the President Irfan Ali. He recently announced that the government will be paying some attention to wage negotiations. But for more than a decade now, increases for public sector workers, that there have been no engagement at all between the government and the recognized majority unions. In fact, in April last year, the Guyana Workers Union and Guyana Trade Union Congress had to stage a whole number of demonstrations in response basically to the rising cost of living. But an interesting development between Guyana and Trinidad occurred when the Guyana Agriculture and General Workers Union and OWTU, our union, we signed last year in July a memorandum of cooperation. What was interesting is the response by the Guyana Oil and Gas Energy Chamber. They condemned the collaboration because they claim that there's good industrial relations in what is, of course, a rapidly rising energy sector in Guyana. But GAWU immediately responded and have continued ramping up their activities to mobilize and organize workers in the sector. And we are willing to help them across in terms of organizing those workers. In May 2022, you had a joint protest between two unions, the Grenada Public Workers Union and the Grenada Union of Teachers, that was organized concerning standing wages for the T.A. Mary Shaw Community College. That is the country's lone local tertiary institution. I mean, they haven't had a salary increase for like 10 years, with the workers working, literally operating on 2 and 12 salaries. Also, the public servants in Grenada here, they've protested in support of the restoration of their pension, with the demand for the constitutionally guaranteed right to a pension on retirement. Of course, these protests and so on led to the Keith Mitchell calling a snap election last year. And one Mitchell lost to another Mitchell, Dickon Mitchell. But then you see some tensions coming down to the end of last year between him and the Grenada Trade Union Council. So it should be interesting to also see what comes out of that tension. Let me now talk about the situation in Trinidad and Tobago. So the big issue right now is this recommendation to increase electricity rates. We already, as the population and as workers, had to endure increasing fuel costs 6 times over the last 7 years. You see, the government failed economic policies. What that is doing is driving them now to place more burden on the population. All right. And there is no real mechanism for any form of discussion on how there should be at least the sharing of the burden of adjustment. The National Tripartite Council, that collapsed. There have been no changes in labor legislation since 72, but since this government came in and has committed to do so, that has not happened. You had retrenchments in the communication, TSTT, 500 workers. At UTT, the University of Trinidad and Tobago, 243 workers. You're having the push for restructuring the water authority, with the government looking at now the Electricity Commission, the postal company, and so on. And all these measures are really consistent with the IMF and World Bank neoliberal measures. The government also, Trinidad and Tobago here, sent the outstanding negotiation, which goes back to 2014. They sent it to court. And like in Jamaica, what had happened as we were mobilizing last year, you had unions breaking ranks and signing for the government 4% over 6-year wage offer. But fortunately, the 3 federations stand and remain united and standing firm and holding the line, even though the matter had gone to court. We had, in response to all of that, launched what is called a Unite to Fight campaign. It's a united front, which took the form of a series of large demonstrations and so on. But what was interesting is that we were kind of doing a kind of coordination for a particular line of action. And to test the waters, we had the teachers union, they took strike action, a 1-day strike. You know, the government immediate response to that was one of the first time in a long time. They filed an injunction forcing the teachers union, and all unions for that matter, not to take strike action. So that comes back to this question of the right to strike and how they are utilizing the power of the state to curb, well, not even curb, repress that important right. Now, this idea of social partnership is big in the region, right? With many, many trade unions, including the Caribbean Congress of Labor, either promoting or trying to advance it, or even actively participating in any such process at the national level. And the Barbados model is often hailed as the best practice, with basically bourgeois commentators and academics insisting that trade unions become part of the process. But what I find, though, is that the pressure is always placed on the trade unions and not the other partners. The reality is that the trade unions will find themselves in those types of arrangement in a very uneven playing field. So in Trinidad and Tobago, for example, the three federations had to all left the National Tripartite Advisory Council. That's supposed to be the mechanism for dialogue and partnership and so on. So then there have been calls now by various quarters, including the president of the Industrial Court, for Labor to return, but no proper discussion by these same quarters as to the reason for the departure and how can the conditions be corrected for Labor to return and to properly participate. So my more general comment on this issue has to do with the balance of forces and the state of the forces. In other words, such a mechanism can only work if there is an equal balance of forces. But when you have a state of affairs in the Caribbean, where capital on one hand, or business more properly described, is actively engaged in the process of extracting more and more value, and the mediating force, the state, collaborates with that interest by systematically weakening labor, then you have an unbalance of forces. And where does that leave social partnership and dialogue? But this is not the discussion by the bourgeois commentators, whether they are economists, political scientists, or what is now this big thing, talk show hosts. All of them just condemning, trade unions and labor and not doing that careful analysis. But then this raises the question, this issue of social partnership and so on. It really raises the question, and I'm speaking here in the context of the Caribbean, this relationship between party, state, and trade unions, right? Now, in the Caribbean context, the three kind of emerged together as a kind of trinity, if you may, all along a sort of proletarian kind of consciousness coming out of the 30s and 40s and so on, and left as well. That's a case that I've always made. But underlying that relationship between party, state, and trade unions, because you'll see different unions align with different parties, and then depending on which party is in power, then the trade unions move accordingly and so on. So there's this really interesting symbiotic relationship that I think needs careful analysis. But in doing that analysis, we must look at the underlying force in terms of that relationship, that underlying force of capital, and how capital positions itself now within our society to extract more surplus value from workers. In closing, comrades all, I believe that the trade unions of the Caribbean, we have to confront the very conditions of the existence of what is becoming a bourgeois Caribbean society. And we must do so by declaring permanent revolution. And let me explain that. I go back to first principles, the resolution, 1938 resolution, because those demands, especially the one on public ownership of energy and public ownership of utilities, etc., those are going to be crucial. And it must act as a reminder that the goal of trade unions cannot be simply an accommodation with capital. Capital is not, there's no appetite for any real collaboration, discussion with labor. They are in crisis, right? And they are going to do whatever it takes to squeeze more surplus value in what can be considered a surplus value squeeze, meaning that they are seeing less and less of their surplus value. So they are doing more and more utilizing, especially these institutions of the World Bank and IMF and so on, using bilateral investment treaties as the instruments to really squeeze more and more surplus value by weakening trade unions, taking away benefits, promoting these business processing outsourcing, etc. The BPOs, they call them now. I think that we have to recognize as it stands in the Caribbean that capital is wielding significant power over our population. And therefore, to regain power for the sake of ordinary working people, Caribbean people, we must keep a particular goal in our mind. And really, and of course, this is subject to debate, and that has to be socialism with Caribbean characteristics, driven and shaped by the Caribbean workers themselves. And the obstacle to that self-mobilization and unity of labor is neoliberalism in all its forms. And therefore, the emancipation of Caribbean labor can only be achieved when it overcomes the inherent contradictions contained in capitalist relations. And this now will require the mobilization of the masses, mobilization of workers, which has to be led by a leadership with a historical, organizational, and revolutionary perspective. And that will be our way forward towards a socialist Caribbean. Thank you. As I close, I want to go back to the object, labor. And when I say labor, I mean labor in its broad sense. I'm talking about just ordinary working people as represented by unionized and ununionized workers. And people like the two young comrades, environmentalists, they're part of labor. We must always, trade unions is one form of labor, but we need to go back to the object, labor. The next is the subject, which is proletarian conscience itself. And we are seeing some of that coming out, and I think Alex said it very well, in terms of some of the unprecedented actions we are seeing by workers, but also the unprecedented action we're seeing by Bibi and her comrades, by young people in the environmental movement. So these things are examples of proletarian conscience manifesting itself and unfolding at this historical stage. But at the end, comrades, we have to take state power. I'm sorry, I can't see it any other way. How we do that, we could always discuss, but it must, we have, as labor and as the proletarian conscience, we have to take state power. We also have to take other structures of power. And here's why. And I want to end with a very stark warning. If we do not do that, it will be taken by ultra-right fascist ideologies that is going to become entrenched. And if we think the world can't get worse, ask those who lived in the latter part of the 1920s and 30s, when the crisis of capital at that time, you did see a rise, of course, of unionization and workers' action across the globe. But comrades, we also saw the rise of fascism and the death of tens of millions of people. So do not for 1 minute think that it cannot get worse. It can. And therefore, we have a huge responsibility to find through education, through our unity, through joint programs and platforms like this. But in the end, labor has to take power. It's the only way we can save this planet, and it's the only way we can really preserve the dignity of humanity. Thank you.